Wanju. I'm Gail McGowan, and I would like to do an acknowledgement of country, pay my respects to the elders past, present, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk Noongar people of the Noongar Nation. It's great to have the first of these webinars, and I think we just want to run you through some of the changes that have happened over the last couple of years, particularly with the bringing together of the heritage and planning functions, and not forgetting the Aboriginal heritage or land use management functions. One of the things we do find is that it's been a very natural fit for us, the interaction of legislation on both land use planning, land use management, heritage and Aboriginal heritage. Each is concerned with concepts of place and how community understands and engages with it. And the bringing together of the various teams has encouraged better understanding and engagement across the whole department. We do have each of those areas now co-located in 140 William Street, so if you happen to be in town, do come and visit us. And that's enabled closer links across the whole agency. We've already achieved the passing of the new Heritage Act in 2018, which I think was our first significant achievement as a department. And then we've had the ongoing development and progression of planning reform, the review of the Aboriginal Heritage Act, and we hope to see a bill actually tabled into the Parliament very, very shortly. In common with other communities and agencies, we've had to respond to COVID and find new ways of working, both in our own workplace and delivering response on behalf of government. I'm incredibly proud of the team in terms of what we've managed to deliver. Planning reform remains a government priority, and it's certainly one of our key work areas and occupies a lot of our time. This webinar is being recorded and will be available from the department's website. So if you're viewing it as a download, it's important to note that this is a snapshot in time and information will change. A review of the local planning scheme regulations is nearing completion, and that's likely to include amendments relevant to heritage. And regulations also around the Heritage Act are also in progress. Wherever you are watching from, this webinar is the first in a series that will cover key areas of heritage. Our second will focus on Aboriginal heritage and culture, and we'll continue with a closer look at heritage for local governments. Today, you'll hear from three members of our team. Our Chief Planning Advisor, Kathy Bonus, will be outlining some of the heritage concepts within planning. Callum Crofton, the Manager of our Heritage Support Services, will take us step by step through the decision-making process and identifying those elements that can change where heritage is involved. But first, though, I'd like to introduce you to Harriet Wyatt, who many of you may know anyway. Harriet's the Director of our Heritage Policy and Practice, and she'll set the scene with an overview of heritage. I won't be able to stay with you, but I wish you all the best for the rest of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, for that introduction. Before we kick off into the sort of techie part of this webinar, I just want to cover a few housekeeping side of things. Those of you who are live stream viewers, you can choose to watch the presenter or both, and you do that by going to the top of your screen to view options and then choose side-by-side mode. We will be taking questions during the webinar, and these can be submitted via chat, which we will review towards the end. The presentation will last around 40 minutes, and then we'll allow some time to answer some of your questions. As Gail indicated, this webinar will be recorded and available on our website. If there are questions that we don't get around to or are submitted later, then answers may be posted alongside the video. Okay, well, let's kick off. What do we mean by historic heritage? We use the term historic heritage simply to differentiate it from Aboriginal heritage. Aboriginal heritage is not to be ignored in the planning framework. It just needs a slightly different process that will be covered in a future seminar. Some areas of the planning framework use the term built heritage conservation to indicate intended focus. Other terms such as European heritage are used to cover similar areas. We acknowledge that none of these are ideal, but these are terms that you may come across during your work. Key documents for heritage conservation. The main one is the Borough Charter, which sets out principles that have been adopted to create a nationally accepted standard for heritage conservation practice in Australia. The legal framework that is relevant to today's material comes from the Heritage Act of 2018, the Planning and Development Act of 2005, and the supporting regulations for each. Let's look at some key concepts. Place. This is fundamentally a land-based system and requires a definition of area, hence the use of the word place. Place can include built structures, archaeological remains, gardens and parks. It can be a single element, a group, a precinct, or indeed a landscape. It's further defined in the Heritage Act what we mean by place. In planning, a place most commonly incorporates built structures, either individually or in groups. We also need to consider the concept of setting or curtilage, the area that contributes to the significance of a place, and also this curtilage can provide a buffer zone. In practice, many heritage places fall within cadastral lot boundaries. However, on rare occasions, the setting or elements of significance can stretch beyond the drawn boundary, where significance includes views into or from the wider landscape. This should be considered when reviewing potential impacts, hence the use of a buffer zone can be appropriate. Practicalities of planning, however, rarely allow such a broad interpretation. Another important concept is significance, cultural heritage significance. An assessment of heritage considers a series of values: historic, aesthetic, social, scientific, and spiritual. Many places display one or several different values, and these values are a set of criteria that help us guide the assessment of a place and are summarized in what we call the statement of significance. The state assessment of places considers HERCON criteria, which are underpinned by those 5 concepts I've mentioned. Assessment generally requires the input of an experienced heritage professional. Looking at values is necessarily a subjective process, but there is an expectation that a heritage listing will be informed by consultation with the people who know the place and made with the guidance of heritage professionals within a consistent and transparent framework. Let's look at the term fabric and what we mean by that. The Borough Charter explains fabric as all the physical materials of a place. We also talk about original fabric and significant fabric. Significant fabric is likely to include the original fabric of the place when it was constructed, but may also include elements that are added by later development that help tell the story of the place. Depending on the values, fabric may be less important. Some heritage places have little significant fabric, for example, archaeological sites. Without detailed study, what is significant fabric may need to be inferred from available documentary information or physical evidence. There again, there's the need for an expert advice. We also talk about the impact on fabric, and particularly where change or proposed change may harm the cultural significance of a place and have a negative impact. Most commonly, this impact may include removal of significant fabric through demolition or alteration. New development that could mask, alter, or change perceptions of a place may also have a negative impact. The Borough Charter provides us with a process on which to follow when considering management of heritage places. Under the Borough Charter, people involved in the conservation of heritage places should understand the place and its cultural significance, including its meaning to people within the community, before making decisions about its future. We should care for its cultural significance and other significant attributes, taking account of all aspects of significance, including the setting. From that, we're going to look to develop policy to guide future management, which includes providing an appropriate use and security for the place, remembering to use available expertise and professional assistance when required, and to make records of the place and changes to it and the reasons for these decisions. The Borough Charter advocates a cautious approach to changing a place. Only the work that is necessary to repair and secure and to make the place function is recommended, so that the history of the place can continue to be recognised. So let's have a look at what we mean by adaptive reuse. One of the factors acknowledged in the heritage conservation process is that heritage places are better conserved if they have a compatible use. Compatible in this case primarily means one that doesn't require substantial change to the fabric, although maintaining the traditional use of the place is generally preferred. A place that is in active use receives ongoing care and maintenance and will generally suffer less from vandalism and damage. Reusing heritage places also provides environmental and financial saving in embodied energy, limits the creation of waste and the need for new building materials. Alterations and additions don't have to be a reproduction of the original building. There's a fine balance between respecting the heritage fabric of the past and identifying new elements so that the history of the place and its evolution can be clearly understood in the future. Heritage is not simply about preserving the past at all costs. It's about guiding and managing change in such a way that heritage values are respected and, where possible, retained. Why conserve? Another key concept is an understanding of why heritage as a community benefit should be considered when determining a response to an individual's proposal for their own property. As we're looking at heritage in the planning context, I'll focus on planning related material. The State Planning Strategy 2050 identifies that culture, heritage, and the arts contribute to the identity, sense of belonging, and desirability of communities. And it notes that heritage tourism can contribute to the rejuvenation of regional and urban areas and spread economic benefit across a wide geographical area. It also goes on to say that adaptive reuse of heritage buildings provides continuity for the community and helps to maintain its identity in the face of ongoing change. The state planning policy that has been developed to guide decision-making for historic places, SPP 3.5, is clear that Western Australia's rich historic heritage is a significant asset for the state. The protection and management of that heritage is important to our social, environmental, and economic prosperity. To understand how conservation of heritage places is enabled through the planning framework, I'll now hand you over to Kathy.
Thank you very much, Harriet. More from SPP 3.5, and I'm going to read this quote. I haven't memorised SPP 3.5. Tensions between those committed to retaining the best from the past and those committed to building the new or optimising property investments are common to most modern societies. The planning system provides one of the mechanisms by which those tensions can be resolved. So in this section, we're actually going to look at some of the ways in which the planning system engages with heritage to help resolve those tensions. But we should first acknowledge that the concept of heritage and conservation is actually not new. It actually, in Western Australia, was in our very first Planning Act, in the Town Planning Development Act of 1928. Now, it didn't use the term heritage, but what it did say, it did make provision for the preservation of historic buildings and objects of historical or scientific interest. So right back in 1928, that was recognised as being important in our system. Mechanisms for enabling this protection and preservation have become much more detailed over time, though. In 1967, we had the Town Planning Regulations, which introduced the model scheme text, and that has continued. So that had the heritage conservation and preservation protections in it.
And it's continued through with the adoption of SPP 3.5 in 2007, and then subsequently with the implementation of the new local planning scheme regulations in 2015. In general, the planning framework allows for heritage places to be identified, and that's a requirement for a heritage list. So that's where local governments state in advance the properties that it intends to protect and it considers to be of heritage value to its community. The heritage list is, of course, adopted under the local planning scheme. The planning framework also provides local government with the ability to declare heritage areas. All places on the state register or otherwise included or protected under the Heritage Act of 2018 should also be included. And note that just being included in the local heritage survey, it does not count. It does not give you that legal protection or that legislative protection under the planning scheme. Normal planning processes can be varied for the protection and preservation of heritage. So exemptions that would normally allow owners to undertake works without development approval don't generally apply to heritage places because of the need to protect that valuable resource. Specifications to works for state registered places to require development applications under section 163. It's important that we actually collect the appropriate information and get the appropriate advice when dealing with a heritage place. The decision maker can require additional information that's necessary to understand the impact on a heritage protected place with a development application. And there's also the need for extra accompanying material for those applications. And that's outlined in the local planning schemes regulations. Places on the state register, those proposals must be referred to the Heritage Council for advice under the Heritage Act, and that interacts with the Planning and Development Act with the requirement for a development application. There are also concessions and benefits available to encourage heritage outcomes. Where it provides a conservation outcome, the local government can vary scheme provisions to allow for development that might not otherwise be able to be approved, and also the ability to add further scheme provisions that provide planning benefit where a project includes heritage conservation. And of course, a number of local governments also at a local level may also provide some additional incentives. At the heart of this, however, is the ability for a proposal to be considered for its impact on heritage, and where it's appropriate, it can also be refused on heritage grounds. In common with most planning matters, the application of heritage provision can be varied by local governments to respond to local conditions and to community expectations. Some local governments have identified heritage as being a key contributor to that local area, and it's well supported by the community. They will generally include more places on their heritage list and declare more heritage areas. And they'll also have positive policies developed that enable and support good heritage outcomes. We'll also often find in those places that landowners themselves may actually be nominating their own properties to go onto heritage lists or within heritage areas, and not just waiting for local government to identify them. Others have determined that their local community actually has other priorities, and they may provide the minimum statutory consideration of heritage. It is important to note that heritage provisions in planning ensure that the decision-making process is well informed and gives an opportunity for heritage matters to be considered. It does not expect or intend that planning decisions will always or only be determined to favour heritage outcomes. Further, giving due regard to both heritage and community demand on a site can actually deliver opportunities that provide community benefit through heritage conservation and meet the needs of the applicant. Perhaps the most valuable contributors to good heritage outcomes in planning are the allocation of sufficient time and creativity for both the applicant and the decision maker. From SPP 3.5 again, effectively conserving heritage assets requires a balanced, integrated and imaginative approach which properly takes into account the views of landowners, the community and state and local government. Because there are statutory time constraints on formal applications, planners should encourage early consultation and negotiation on all heritage-related projects, particularly where they are complex or they propose a significant impact on a heritage place. This allows all parties to identify and discuss options that are open to them and ways that project goals can be met while still giving due consideration to heritage. And where that early negotiation can occur before the submission of a formal development application, you often have a greater opportunity to be able to get better outcomes, again, for the local government, but also for the applicant. Progressing these negotiations require a sound understanding of the range of tools that you have available in the planning framework. And that's something that we're going to explore next. So I'm going to hand over to Callum Crofton, who's going to take us through the different steps of the planning process and detail some of the tools and mechanisms that are relevant to heritage and planning.
Thank you, Kathy, and good morning, everyone. We're going to take you back to Harriet's explanation of the conservation process, and we can apply a similar approach to guide determination of a planning application that needs to consider heritage. So first of all, we need to understand. We need to understand the place, its heritage values and significant fabric, and we need to understand the proposal, how the completion of the proposed works would impact on the values and the fabric of the place. We then look at the policy framework. What influences our decision making, where we'll find guidance, and what expectation the planning system has of us. And finally, we need to look at what recommendation we make and how that takes into account the relevant policies in practice. So first of all, finding the information. So we need to confirm the basis for applying a heritage process to this application. So this will generally be required if the site is included in a heritage list, in a heritage area, it's on the State Register, or there is some other interest under the Heritage Act. And these are articulated in the Dean provisions. Local governments will have information on their own heritage listed places and areas, and the department is working with local governments to make this available through the Shared Land Information Platform, the SLIP. Mapping these places is an important part of identifying where they should be considered and which values, which list they should be applied to. State heritage interests are already included in mapping and should be available to planners and anyone else with an interest. It's important to note that proposed works may affect places around the subject site, not just the site itself. Heritage provisions may therefore be applied if the subject site is not itself a heritage place, but the works have the potential to impact a nearby heritage place. This is one of the harder judgment calls for planners, and generally it's often raised only for major projects and often limited to state heritage interests, but it can be applied where you feel that heritage in general may be affected by development. If you have inquiries about making this call for impact on state registered places, the department's heritage development team would be happy to discuss that with you, so do feel free to give them a call. Once we've established that heritage is in play for a particular proposal, we need to identify where we're going to find information about the heritage significance and values for a place. So this may come from a number of sources. So for state heritage, it will be included in information held by the Heritage Council and available through the Statement of Significance. For local heritage, it will primarily be derived from information already held by the local government in the assessments carried out for the local heritage survey. There are some local governments who are doing a more in-depth study for places that are put on the heritage list or have information that they generally held through a local studies library or other historic information. But you can, if needed, commission a separate assessment for places proposed for inclusion or where there is proposal for works. If the application relates to a heritage area, then the local planning policy for the area should articulate heritage values in general and identify whether the individual property has heritage significance that contributes to the area. Information on individual properties may also be found, as I say, articulated in the record for a place found associated with the local heritage survey. We need to reiterate here that while information about a place on the heritage list or in a heritage area comes from the local heritage survey, as Harriet said, the inclusion of a place only on the local heritage survey is not intended to bring it within the heritage provisions of the local planning scheme. For any place, but more likely one of state heritage significance, there may be further documentation such as a conservation management plan, and that can provide some more detailed information. The deemed provisions do give the option for local government to require the applicant to provide a heritage assessment, but this is recommended only as a last resort. It is noted that the general intent is that the heritage of a place should be determined by the local government or the Heritage Council in advance and identified to the owner so that they're aware of expectations for the place. The deemed provisions make specific arrangements for the management of significant heritage interiors through the planning process. The carrying out of internal building work is normally exempt from the need for development approval, but this is another area where heritage places are treated differently and don't exercise the same rights. And this is covered in section 61B of the deemed provisions. In this instance, there's a key difference for local heritage places. All places of state interest, again on the state register or otherwise protected under the Heritage Act, require development approval for all works, including interior works. However, for the interior of a local heritage place to be brought within the heritage provisions of the local planning scheme, it must be an individual place on the heritage list, and the heritage list must identify that it has an interior with cultural heritage significance. Some local governments have indicated that they're comfortable with the concept that local heritage is primarily concerned with the public domain, and therefore don't designate the places on the heritage list as having a significant interior. And therefore, all interior works to local places can continue without development approval. Others have a more holistic view of heritage and consider it important to manage all heritage fabric, in which case they conduct an assessment, designate interiors of significance, and then require planning approval. An interior will generally be assessed as part of a heritage assessment to create the local heritage survey. For those undertaking a separate review for the heritage list, this may be an area that's reserved for a more detailed survey study. So the initial survey just looks at the place in general, and a more detailed survey looks at the interior. But that's an option. If an interior is found to contribute to significance, this should be recognised in the statement of significance. And it's recommended that it is made very clear and specified in the heritage list as having an interior of cultural heritage significance. Several local governments have noted that this approach puts the onus of proof on local government and allows owners to block an assessment simply by denying access. This means that some significant interiors may be missed and potentially lost. So this is one area that is being looked at as part of the current review of the deemed provisions. For the time being, it's important to note that works to interiors are covered for places of state interest and development applications are required, and that these proposals should still be referred to the Heritage Council for advice. For the local governments who have designated heritage interiors, then the same applies. Development approvals are still needed. Once we have an understanding of the heritage values, we can turn our attention to the proposed works and how these may impact on the heritage of a place. The deemed provisions allow for additional material to be required for applications that relate to heritage places. These are detailed in section 63.3, but a more general provision is given for the applicant to undertake any specialist studies, with heritage noted as a potential subject. For local governments that commonly receive heritage-related applications, it's recommended that a local planning policy is adopted to articulate when these additional accompanying materials should be provided, so that applicants can prepare in advance. And these are the accompanying materials that are shown on the slide. street elevations, schedules of finishes, and descriptions of finishes of adjacent developments. These are all matters that will help to identify impacts of development. The department is currently working with local governments to develop guidelines and sample text for a local planning policy that contains general provisions for heritage places and areas that can make clear what accompanying materials may be required for heritage places. One of the key forms of specialist study that relates to heritage is the Heritage Impact Statement, which identifies the various ways in which a proposal may interact with the heritage values of a place. Most proposals that are referred to the Heritage Council will require the applicants to submit a Heritage Impact Statement. But this form of report may also be appropriate for major projects relating to local heritage. Where applications are referred to the Heritage Council, the role of the planner is made somewhat simpler, given that advice on heritage can generally be left to the Heritage Council to provide. Note though that the Heritage Council will only provide information in relation to state heritage values. Depending on the context of the application, there may be local heritage matters that the local government would still wish to consider under its own assessment. So the concept of negative or adverse impact is a key part of the decision making and worth spending a little bit of time on. In heritage generally, we start from the perspective that in best practice conservation, there's a principle that while necessary change is accepted, we keep that change as a minimum. And again, as has already been stated, do as much as necessary, but as little as possible. There's therefore a preference that significant fabric is retained, and that's a good underlying principle to start with. We're looking at how we affect and how we adversely affect cultural heritage significance. It's a simple statement to say that heritage significance is adversely affected if any of the attributes set out in the statements of significance are made less true by any action. As an example, a building noted as a local landmark will be adversely affected if it's demolished, or if views to it are blocked by new development. It's no longer a landmark. A place that's identified for aesthetic values is likely to be adversely affected if features contributing to its design and aesthetics are removed, or if they're altered or hidden. A place that's significant for a particular use or function will be adversely affected if the physical evidence of that use or function is removed or again, hidden, obscured by new development. We should note that not all works will have a negative impact on heritage values. There may be parts of a site noted as not contributing to heritage values or even intruding on heritage values, being intrusive. Where possible, change should be directed to areas that contain these non-contributory or intrusive elements. For some places, the heritage significance is less dependent on keeping intact the physical elements of the site, and they can therefore accommodate change more readily. Places that are noted as being the site of a particular thing generally indicate that significant fabric has already been lost. One thing to note here, however, is the potential for archaeological deposits that could provide information about the past structures and use. And archaeology is certainly something that should be considered when looking at applications, proposals for work, and potentially conditioning works on further studies, surveys that can identify more of the archaeology and where necessary, uncover it. So archaeological potential is something that should be considered for all heritage places, but in particular where it has been identified in the statement of significance. We flagged earlier on that sometimes an understanding of significant fabric needs to be inferred from other evidence. If you're lucky enough to have a conservation management plan, each element of the place is generally identified in a plan showing zones of significance. So it's clear which elements contribute to the values of the place. These unfortunately aren't very common, and it's often left to the planner to determine from basic statements about the place what heritage fabric might be. Even where an application is accompanied by full documentation and a competent heritage impact statement, planners will need support and may need to contract specific advice from a heritage practitioner to identify significant fabric and the likely impact of works on heritage values. So once we've gathered our information, we're going to need assistance in how we guide a decision. The deemed provisions identify a number of relevant matters that must be given due regard in determining an application. Perhaps the most important of these in this context is the requirement to give due regard to any adopted state planning policy. We've mentioned State Planning Policy 3.5, Historic Heritage Conservation, and this has been adopted to guide development of heritage places. It gives sound principles for supporting heritage conservation outcomes and details development controls that can be applied. And some of these are articulated on the slide. So SPP 3.5 can act as a default policy for heritage places and should be considered as part of any relevant application. The deemed provisions also require that due regard is given to the conservation of any place of cultural heritage significance. This is section 67K. So, fairly clear statement that heritage should be considered. And finally, any local planning policy should also be given due regard. And as noted, some local governments will choose to adopt a local planning policy for heritage. So decision makers should already have a clear understanding that due regard is not just a cursory consideration. It is giving proper regard and consideration to all of these matters. However, we also acknowledge that the deemed provisions list a broad range of other matters that must also be given due regard. These won't always be incompatible with heritage, but sometimes the decision maker will need to make a call between supporting heritage over other matters. This is where the guidance of the planner and/or specialist advice is most important. Where there's room for negotiation, particularly in pre-lodgement or those early discussions that, as we say, we do encourage, it may be possible to give notice to the applicant of any significant issues and determine whether they can be resolved through changes to the works proposed for a place. If impacts have been identified, discussions with the applicant should explore first whether adverse impacts can be removed. If they can't be removed, then can they be reduced? At the end of these discussions, if negative impacts remain, opportunities should be explored to offset or mitigate these by delivering positive heritage outcome elsewhere in the development. The deemed provisions provide some clear options that can assist in guiding heritage projects towards more positive outcomes. Sometimes these will have been picked up by the applicant already and will already be applied within the proposal. The heritage protection part of the deemed provisions allow the local government to vary development requirements to support heritage conservation. This can add flexibility to allow the applicant to meet their key needs for the project, whilst also retaining significant fabric or otherwise providing a better heritage outcome. The local planning scheme may also specify other mechanisms to offer incentives for conservation, such as additional development rights. Again, local governments regularly using these provisions may benefit from adoption of local planning policies that articulate what variations are acceptable and what conservation benefits are expected in return for such concessions. Where a concession is sought, or where there's otherwise reason to bind an owner into delivering a specified conservation outcome, there's the option to require that the owner signs a heritage agreement. Once the application has been reviewed and any potential changes explored with the applicant, the usual recommendations can be made on the final proposal, and those recommendations would be either to approve with conditions, or refuse. Section 75 of the Heritage Act requires that for proposals referred under the Act to the Heritage Council, the decision maker's final decision is consistent with the Heritage Council advice. In practice, this generally means that where the Heritage Council gives conditional support, those conditions should appear in the final decision if approval is granted. If the Heritage Council determines that a proposal cannot be supported on heritage grounds, the application should be refused on heritage grounds. For situations not guided by the Heritage Council, planners will need to make recommendations on whether there are grounds for adding conditions to an approval or refusing an application. That's what we'll look at next. Similar to what we were saying earlier about negotiating ways to limit likely impacts on heritage significance, conditions should first be used where possible to remove impacts. If that's not possible, then aim to reduce them. And when they can't be avoided or other planning priorities apply, you can look to offset or mitigate the impact through positive heritage benefits. As planners will be aware, there are some constraints on the extent to which conditions can change an application. However, sometimes only a small change is needed to remove or reduce an impact. For example, a condition requiring that original fabric is retained rather than demolished may allow a project to continue and give the applicant an outcome that still meets their needs while reducing negative impacts. A change in materials may make new development more suited to a heritage context and be enough to get the project over the line. Where some negative impacts cannot be avoided, there are a number of conditions that can provide a heritage benefit to offset that negative impact. One of the functions of retaining heritage fabric is to enable the place to tell its own story. The history and use of a building should be able to be read from its layout, materials, fixtures and fittings. So when new development causes these elements to be lost or hidden, interpretation can be used as an alternative means of sharing the history of a place. So a condition can require the development and implementation of an interpretation plan. If we're losing these features that would allow us to read a building, then interpretation is the alternative, the offset. Or we can identify specific actions that meet the same requirement, such as identifying the location of walls or other features that have been removed. The Heritage Act allows for the preparation of a heritage agreement as a means of securing heritage outcomes over the short, medium and long term, both from the current and future owners. As a legal contract between the owner and the state, these should be used sparingly, but can be put in place as a condition of approval where the ongoing care and maintenance of a heritage place needs to be secured. Use of heritage agreements is one area that we'll cover in more detail in our future webinar focusing on heritage for local governments, but that's certainly something that we're welcome to talk with the department about. Finally, on conditions, as a last resort in preserving information about a place, approval to remove significant fabric can be made conditional on completion of an archival record. This provides some mitigation for the loss of fabric, but the ability to make an archival record should not be used as a justification for the approval of demolition. There are various standards of archival record, and Heritage Council guidelines give further information. Remember that an archival record is intended to convey information, so thought should be given to where the record is to be stored and how it should be made available. As with all conditions, those imposed to reduce heritage impacts must be relevant to the matter in hand. They must be imposed for a planning purpose, and they must be reasonable and proportionate. If you find that your list of conditions growing or require fundamental changes to the application, you may find that you're better considering refusal. As a final note, we should acknowledge that the planning regulations adopted in 2015, the local planning scheme regulations, brought in the ability for local governments to take proactive measures to protect heritage places through the use of a heritage conservation notice. So where the local government forms a view that a heritage place is not being properly maintained, which is defined in relation to potential loss of heritage significance, It can issue a written notice requiring specified repairs to address the maintenance issues. If the works are not carried out as directed, the local government can undertake works and recover costs. A person given heritage conservation notice can apply to the State Administrative Tribunal for review. In common with other orders and compliance measures, the heritage conservation notice should be used with due consideration. If any local government is in a situation where they're considering a heritage conservation notice, again, we'd be happy for you to discuss this with the department. This is another area for which we would hope to have guidelines and potentially suggestions for a related local planning policy. That's something that we're working on at present. So today's webinar has been a fairly broad synopsis of the interaction of heritage within the planning system in WA. And some of the key messages that we'd like you to take away from this session are listed here. So it is intended that local governments use a heritage list or heritage areas to identify those places to which the heritage provisions of the local planning scheme will be applied. It is not sufficient for a place only to be listed in the local heritage survey. And there's a key difference between these two documents, the local heritage survey and the heritage list. Good heritage practice is based on making decisions that are guided by sound policy and proper understanding. The planning framework provides mechanisms for gathering information to add to our understanding and for offering guidance on decision making. Heritage is one of the matters to be given due regard in a planning decision. And detailed guidance is provided in SPP 3.5. Do remember that as a basic planning policy for heritage if you don't have a separate one. It is open to each local government to consider how it intends to apply the planning process and make additional policy as necessary, understanding that direction on state heritage values will be given by the Heritage Council. There are tools available to assist in determining how a proposal will impact on heritage, such as a heritage impact statement. And again, another key one to remember. These can be required from the applicant, but it's also open to the decision maker to seek independent advice and conduct its own heritage impact assessment. Negotiation and the use of conditions can seek to change a proposal in order to remove, reduce, or mitigate negative impacts. And finally, where a proposal would adversely affect the cultural heritage significance of a place, there is the option to refuse an application. So the department is continuing to work on resources and assistance, and there are a number of different sources of material on the website. So have a browse through there. There are guidelines that we have and some more in development. You can always email the team. We've created a separate email, heritagesport@dplh.wa.gov.au, and feel free to email us with any of your queries. DPLH also works with the Planning Institute, WILGA, and others to provide training and information, and these webinars accompany a series of workshops that we're currently running through October and November. And if you've got any questions, suggestions, requests, or calls for help, please get in touch. And on that, we'll see what questions you've got. Okay, so one of the matters that's often raised in relation to the recent proposals for the Dean provisions is the question on heritage lists. And as we all know, the heritage lists at present require that every local government adopt a heritage list. And the proposals for the local plan scheme regulations suggested that one option was that the must was going to be taken out, and that was replaced by may. So I'll ask Kathy, what feedback has there been on this?
Thank you, Callum. That's a very interesting question. Look, it's something that actually attracted a lot of feedback from local government. And it's probably fair to say that the idea of that proposal to change the must establish a heritage list to may establish a heritage list actually originated several years ago, not long after the local plan scheme regulations first came into being, because it was seen at that time, and I was in local government at that time, as being quite an onerous requirement for a number of local governments. We kind of moved from a previous situation where some local governments had heritage lists, many others relied on what was then called the municipal heritage inventory, and the whole area of heritage planning was probably less well integrated than what it has come to be since then. So when that was drafted and put out to public consultation, we received a lot of feedback on that. And what we've found really in the intervening years since the 2015 regulations have come into place is that there's actually now a much better understanding in local government, and I think probably everywhere, of the role of a heritage list and also the role of heritage areas and how they can interact with the planning system and actually help improve outcomes. So the feedback from local government was that to make that change was probably now seen as not as desirable, and certainly there was a view put forward that it could actually have a negative impact to make that change. So we're going through submissions at the moment and considering that and looking at what the future might be. I think too, since the 2015 regulations, there's actually been a significant increase in the numbers of local governments that have gone through and amended or reviewed their planning schemes, as they're required to be reviewed every 5 years under the regulations, and the corresponding development or expansion or maturation, I think, of heritage lists in that time has also been a contributing factor.
Thank you, Kathy. Another discussion point on heritage lists that's often raised is, and as you were saying, municipal inventories, as they were now local heritage surveys, a lot of local governments had a clause in their scheme that said that the heritage list is the local heritage survey. So one of the questions that we sometimes get is, what is a valid heritage list? So the response that we generally give on that is really looking at the deemed provisions and what the deemed provisions require of a heritage list. So it's required that the heritage list identify each place and articulate the reasons for its being on the list and describe the place. So the department has developed some guidelines which have been endorsed by Heritage Council and WAPC as to what a valid heritage list should look like. And it's important that these are considered carefully for local governments adopting a heritage list. Ideally, there really should be a resolution of council specifying the adoption of a heritage list that's consistent with the deemed provisions. And this is something that we're currently undertaking a project with local governments just to make sure that people do understand that whether they have a heritage list or whether they're still basing decisions on a local heritage survey. So that's an area, it's not a determination by the department or WAPC or the Heritage Council. It's for each local government to determine whether it is complying with the deemed provisions. And on occasion, people are needing to seek legal advice, but we're basically saying if you follow the guidelines, you should be in good stead.
I think there's another question just coming in. We're often, and this is one we often get, where to find good heritage practitioners and professionals. The department's website does have a facility called In Contact, and that's a directory of people who have expressed an interest in being able to deliver heritage professional advice. So, you know, if you're looking for a heritage practitioner or professional to assist in any of the areas we've been discussing today, then please look for the website. The In Contact is the place that you may be able to find someone to help you.
And just on that, and I'm not a heritage professional by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also important, particularly for those of you that might be in regional areas, that in seeking your advice, that you may want to look for someone who perhaps has a little bit more of a connection with your region, because you're probably more likely to be able to be in a position to provide that more localised knowledge. And I know certainly when I was in local government, my interactions with what was then the State Heritage Office, but now the Heritage Support Crew, certainly very helpful in putting us in contact with the relevant people in the relevant areas with relevant backgrounds. So, definitely recommend that you get in contact with these guys if you need some support or assistance, because they're certainly very happy to give it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Kathy. And we look forward to seeing you all next week for our 10 a.m. webinar on Aboriginal heritage and culture. And then in a fortnight's time, we'll come back and we'll be covering heritage for local government. So see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.